So specifically, when and how to strategically say no at work, I think was a topic that came to mind when I first started talking to Marvelous. She asked me to talk about something wellness related. I was trying to think about like my VFA experience and what was like the hardest wellness lesson to learn for me. And it was definitely that. And it's been kind of a recurring theme throughout my career that I think as a fellow or as an entrepreneur, or as someone who works at a startup, it's just a very hard thing to, you want to take every opportunity you get, but it's also really easy to burn yourself out. And I also think there's this layer of, as a woman, that happens a little bit more and a little bit more strongly. So I was a 2015 fellow. I came to Birmingham to work at a startup called Pack Health, this digital health coaching company. And when I started there, I had all these great ideas and I was so excited to share them and so excited to, do anything I could. And it was like, I learned very quickly that every time I shared an idea, my boss was going to be like, okay, you want to do that? And that'll be your thing. And then suddenly, my whole life was work. So I think from that to, I then worked for a nonprofit where I worked directly with founders. And I saw that, okay, that's actually a very entrepreneurial thing, but they're also very burnt out from doing that, from every time they see an opportunity, just running after it. So thinking about how to strategically say no, so that you're saying yes and doing things to their fullest. One thing I saw with those entrepreneurs is that when they did strategically say no and had that strategic focus, their yeses became a lot more powerful and they were able to accomplish a lot more. So now I'm actually back on the entrepreneurial side. I'm working with a startup called ResBiotic. We're a probiotic for lung health. Our founder's a physician scientist. Doctors are the hardest people to say no to because they always think they know the most, and they usually do. And founders too, right? It's a very specific personality type. So I continue to get a lot of practice with this, and I don't think anyone's, perfect. But I thought it would be a good topic and that I could kind of share some of my experience, but also make this really interactive. And we could even, like, if people have examples of times where they're like, oh, I should have said no to that, or just kind of think through when you're in these scenarios where you are on the spot. Because so often, right, like ideas come up or asks come up and they feel very, very urgent, right? So how do you give yourself that space to effectively assess the ask? And then, like, if you need to, say a strategic no. And that can look a lot of different ways. That can be a no, I don't really have time for this right now. Let's help me understand what the priorities are, because if I say yes to this, we're not going to achieve XYZ that I see as the priority. Are we on the same page about that? Or it could be, that's not really in my wheelhouse. This other person would be way better at that. Why not give them that assignment? Like, there's so many different ways to do that. So thinking about first how to give yourself the space to assess that, and then how to kind of position that no into, almost a yes, but a yes to something else that gives you your time back. So yeah, before I kind of thought, really decided on this, I did Google a couple HBR articles and get a sense of what the experts had to say. And I think there was one line that really stuck out at me, and it was this idea that I'm an entrepreneur, I'm optimistic by nature, but hope is not there's always a shot something can work in a time frame, but hope is not a strategy. And I think that happens a lot too, is like, sometimes your worst enemy is your own optimism and just being like, am I just hoping I can do this? Or is this really feasible? Like, taking that step back to have those extra questions is really helpful. So what the experts had to say, number one, assess their request. So that goes into, what is the time frame for this? What are the actual deliverables? When does it need to be accomplished? But also, who is the asker, right? Is this someone who, when they say by next week, they're going to be asking for it tomorrow? Or are they someone who, is kind of asking for things all the time, but doesn't necessarily, who's the asker? What does need to be accomplished? What resources will be required? And then what sources of authority or kind of bottlenecks could you potentially have, right? Like, who else really needs to be consulted or involved in order to accomplish it? What are the possible benefits? Like, what's the actual goal here? And then what kind of obvious or hidden costs might there be? It's in the short term, it feels great to get a yes. But when you are able to call out some risks or challenge someone to really define their goals, you actually might get more respect in that scenario, and not have to do the thing you don't really want to do. I think the time thing is a really big one too. When you're thinking about by when does it need to be accomplished, it's also really easy to be like, okay, I could do this, and kind of have that like hope strategy, but that might be bleeding into after work or weekend hours. And what you want to, when you think about what else you want to accomplish during that time, I think it's really easy to just think professionally. And I would challenge everyone to also think personally, right? Like, if it's going to mean that you're working on Saturday to get this done, that's still like not really letting you accomplish all your goals, because you have a personal life too. So yeah. And I think, reading through that list of kind of assessing the ask things that were recommended, I think those all really apply, but going that extra step to be like, what do I want to accomplish personally, not just in terms of like the workflow. And then the other things were be straightforward, offer a lifeline. So what are some other ways that they could achieve their goal, like recognizing, what they want and helping them try to solve the problem without necessarily taking it on yourself. One thing I think as a woman in particular, this balance of like not being mean, but also not being too nice is really critical. And then the other thing they talked about that I thought really resonated was the importance of practice, which is why I really wanted to not make this a day about slides and make it more about like, I'm going to share a few other little thoughts, and then I want to kind of open it up to a few other folks to start to think about, what's a time where you might need to say no, and how do you prepare for that? So I think I keep coming back to this idea of a formative assessment, because I think that's the hardest part. And it's, giving yourself the space and time to say no for the right reasons and speak to those reasons. So what are a few ways, when you think about your experiences saying no, has anyone kind of run into this? Are there any things you've been able to kind of say to slow the conversation down, to give yourself the space to make an informed assessment?
I think what's interesting is that, like, at least for me, I always want to say yes. I'm just a yes person. Like, I'm down to help anyone. I'm like, yeah, I'll do that. Oh yeah, let's do it. But then, I'm super quick to get burnt out, just because you really can't do everything 100% all at once. And so what I've found that I've started to do is kind of try to figure out like how serious someone is about something. Like, because if they're serious about it, they're gonna like reach back out to me like once or twice, like after that initial like, hey, let's do this, if that makes sense. So I've just started to like just kind of chill a little bit, like see if they reach out. Like if they reach out to me, then I'll respond like affirmatively again. But I feel like 8 out of 10 times someone just kind of wants, like, they have an idea, and they're like, let's do it, but then they're not like leading it, if it makes sense. And so that's kind of a cop out way that I like sort of say no indirectly. So I don't know if I just answered that question, because but yeah.
So that's when you're getting an ask that's like over email or via text. Do you feel like it's kind of like just giving it a little space to ruminate? Like if they bump it up in your inbox, okay, maybe I'll really work on this.
Right. Or like, obviously we're fellows and like we have ideas and we're hanging out, and someone's like, yo, what would be so cool? Like if we did this thing. It's like, yeah, totally, let's do it. And then it's like, let's see if they reach out again like a week from now and they actually want to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I find that works really well outside of work. At work, like what about when Dave, I know Marvelous's direct report, I know a little too well. What happens when your boss says, hey, we need to do this
It's so
Like,
funny. I was about to ask you that question. What happens? Like, you obviously have many more years of work experience. You were at Pack Health as a fellow. You grew into a director of marketing, and now you're a chief customer officer for ResBiotic. Like, and now you are the boss. Like, how do you deal with that? Like, I'm still entry level. I don't feel comfortable, if I'm going to be super honest, like saying no. I'm like, how high do you want me to jump? Like, I will go miles, and
yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, it's a little too forced sometimes, and I'm like embarrassed, but I'm like, I feel like I can't say no, you know?
yeah. Well, and when
Um,
I was in your position, I think I was the exact same way. And what made matters worse is I just kept creating work for myself. So it was like, it was not healthy. Now, in some ways, that got me to where I am. I think that's, early in your career, like you should be working hard and you should be working late on occasion, because that's how you progress faster and you get ownership of things faster. And then the key is to be able to delegate. And I think that comes from being able to say, hey, like, there's on my own, I can achieve X, but if I had these resources, like we could really achieve 5x, right? And to be able to do that, you have to start to see, okay, these things are really good uses of my time that really pay off, and these things are not. So next time I get the thing that's like, taking a lot of my energy, but not really giving me a lot of return, next time that happens, I need to say, hey, have you noticed that when we do that, we don't really get a lot of return, but when we do that, we get a lot, until eventually the things that are getting you return start to be the things that like, because if things are getting you return, they're also giving you the capacity to start to hire or to start to contract, et cetera. So if you're focusing there, then you can start to say, hey, like maybe we should pull in another resource for this. Like that's really delivering. I don't have enough hours in the day to effectively do this. Also, I have these great strategic ideas that like I could be taking us to this next level, but I'm busy in the weeds executing all these things you need me to do. And so I think that's something like when I was at Pack Health, that definitely was, I think, a big part of my transition to director of marketing is I was writing all the blogs, right? At the beginning, I was the one who was like, we need a blog. Our health advisors were glorified Googlers. They were sending people to WebMD, not WebMD, but like Mayo Clinic. And I was like, at the time we were trying to sell direct to consumer very briefly. We were like, oh, like people would pay for this. And I'm like, people are not going to pay for a glorified Googler. Like it needs to be branded. And that was great for the first couple of months. And then suddenly I'm writing a blog post every day in addition to some of my other responsibilities. I was like, I don't have time for this. But the health advisors who talk to members every day, and you kind of have to be resourceful, right? Like no health advisor ever reported to me. But we built a process to say, okay, these coaches who are dietitians and all these different things, like let's get them on camera. Let's get them writing blogs. Let's get them creating content. And that was a lot of how the content program was born at Pack Health. And that was, I went from marketing associate to content manager to director of marketing, primarily because I was like, I can't do all these things myself. Let's create a process where other people do that for me. So I think that transition happens once you get to the point where you're confident enough in what you're doing from a process perspective that you can teach it to others. And then you're resourceful enough. And that's the hard part of a startup is because so often, like we were really lucky because our product, or I was really lucky because our product involved really qualified people that I could get like 10% of their time to do that. And now like one of the health advisors became the content manager, and now she's the director of, or actually I think she's a VP of Pack Studios. She's like really built out that member content. It's a whole big part of their business, right? So
I mean, now you're leader. How do you create space for people to say no, like strategically say no?
well, and as a leader, a lot of your job is to be able to say no on other people's behalf. And interestingly, I find that a lot easier. Like I'm much better at protecting my team's time than I am at protecting my own, which is interesting. Now that said, like it's a balance because you never want people to be um, to be underworked either, which sounds counterintuitive, but it's not very motivating when your job isn't challenging. And I think that's a big part too of startups is like being able to motivate people to take on things within, outside of their scope and kind of get creative about your resources. But then also, you can't necessarily afford to give people raises every time you really think they deserve a raise, or you can't necessarily hire for the position that supports them because you just don't have the resources to do that. So how do you balance those things? That's where it gets a little tricky, I would say. Like, I think most of my team feels pretty comfortable saying no, but they also would love to get more resources. And I'm like, maybe we could, but like, until we really need it, we're not gonna get someone to support this role because we don't, like, they can do all the work, right? So to some degree, to startup, like, you really have to work yourself out of a job. My approach as a leader is to, help my team understand that, right? Like, this is what it would take. This is what driving value looks like in your role. Like, let's work towards that. Let's make sure that you're able to prioritize that. And honestly, like, sometimes I might not be as close to it as they are. I might not see as soon as they do that something's not as valuable or something is more valuable because they're going to get the indicators first, right? Especially like my customer experience manager, like, she talks to customers all day, every day. Her job isn't just to do that. Her job is to make sure I know what she's learning on the ground, right? Because the more strategic she is, the more strategic I can be, and the faster I can be strategic, right? So I think that's a big part of it too. And that a big part of like motivating people to want to stay at a startup, right? Like, you get burnt out, not just because you have too much work, but because your work isn't really appreciated or your opinion isn't valued. And that's the same reason, like, you might feel like kind of disempowered to say no. Like, the more empowered you are to say no, the more empowered you also are to say yes, because the more strategically you're thinking about your time, the more you're actually adding value to the business. I think it's kind of a counterintuitive. Like, if I'm not doing it, I'm not working hard. It's like, it's not really true. My first boss used to always, I hated it when he would say this. He was like, work smarter, not harder, all the time. And it made me feel like he didn't think I was smart. And it drove me, like, it like hurt every time he said it. And now I'm like, it's all I can do not to say it to my team because it was so correct. It's like, sometimes strategic laziness is the best trait you can have in a business. I don't know. Has anyone had that experience? Like, what do you guys think keeps you? I think really early in your career, there's definitely that, like, you don't know enough to strategically say no, probably your first year or so. Like, you should take on every challenge. But I think most of you guys are, I don't know, what percentage of people are which year? Are most people 2020 fellows, 2021 fellows? I think for those of you guys who are a year,
drop them in the chat.
Yeah, feel free to pop things in chat too, if anyone's like wants to. I mean, Marvelous, you're kind of at that turning point, right? You're starting to, like, a lot about the business, right? Have you had an opportunity where ask where you're like, I don't think that's the best use of my time? And like, how did you approach that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I feel like I get those a lot, but we're still a small team. We've got some 2019 fellows, there's two 2021 fellows, two 2018 fellows. Cool. We're on the gamut here. I think now that, what makes me comfortable saying no is that I now, not just the fact that I understand the business, but I now have built a relationship with my boss, who's the CEO, and he's opened that space up for me for feedback. And he slacks me and he's like, hey, like, if there's ever anything that, you feel like we could do better, like, let me know. And when I first started, I think he always said that. Like, when I first started, I just felt like, I think I thought to myself, like, do you really mean that? Like, do you really want me to tell you? Like, okay, I'm too scared, I won't say anything. But now I'm like, yeah, dude, like, this ain't working, or like, I'm super cash because, like, I buy into our mission, our vision, and our thesis as much as he buys into it. And part of it is because we are small. So I'm like, if he's not going to do it, I'm going to have to do it. But I think the fact that he's created the space to answer your question has made me feel more comfortable saying, hey, like, maybe we wait on this, or hey, like, maybe we try it this way.
Yeah. I think Dave does a great job of that. Not all managers do. One thing I would say for anyone who's like listening to Marvelous's experience and being like, God, I wish my manager was like that. Like, you can also, I think early in my career, I feel like I had a lot of people talk to me about managing up. And I think a lot of times that's really framed in terms of like managing your manager's workflow and helping them be accountable to you. But what I don't think it's always thought about is in terms of like strategic priorities. I do think you can kind of invite what Marvelous is describing with her manager by, instead of saying like your first response to something you don't want to do, could be just like, sure, whatever, and I'll do it anyway. Or it could be like, no, I don't want to do that. Or it could be like, interesting idea. Like from your perspective, what's the goal of this? Like, how does this fit into these goals that I fully understand? Are there new goals that I'm not fully understanding? Like really using as an opportunity to kind of pull a better sense of their picture. And then also like, how does this relate to their work? Like, what is this enabling them to do? How would they go about it, right? Because sometimes also like I've had this happen where I've delegated a task that I think is like a 2-minute task and my team members spent like a day on it, and like I'm like, what were you like, why did this take so long? And then I realized like I didn't really give them the best, I assumed that they knew certain things that they didn't. And now actually my strategy with my team members is a lot of times when we do a project, instead of kind of giving a high level roadmap of what I think should be done, is I ask them, I say, here's the goal. Like, can you write me up like what you think needs to be done to achieve it? And then like, we're going to like, this is going to be a priority this week. So that I can see like from their perspective, how are they going to approach it? And then I can just strategically fill in the gaps of their knowledge. Because oftentimes if I do it from my knowledge, I miss certain gaps that I didn't realize I didn't have. And I think that that can kind of go both ways, where you can ask that of your manager as well, and be proactively like, here's how I'm going about this. Here are the questions I have before I waste time going down any rabbit holes, just because I think like my approach to this feels like it's going to take longer than what you're wanting this to take. Like let's level set and like make sure that we're on the same page here. I think that can be really powerful, and it really builds trust too, like to what Marvelous is talking about with, feeling comfortable speaking up because she's got that relationship and that trust. I think there's also like a comfort level to see a no in a positive light, which a manager builds when a team member shows that they are really thinking strategically and being, kind of proactive about managing their own work. That's like the last thing anyone wants to do is micromanage you. If they really do want to micromanage you, like they might not be that great. You probably don't want to work for them. And they will, like a good manager will like get involved to the degree that you need them to be, but they want you to be able to work independently, right? And so the more you can like show that that's what you're wanting to do, and that you're wanting to, just be as efficient and valuable as possible, like you're only going to get more respect and value for that.
I have a question for you, Maggie. I mean, you kind of talked a little bit about, when you're at the stage of like being entry level, you don't have the room to really say no. And I think when, I'm trying to assess when to say no, I have to think about like how much of this is like, it's not in my job description kind of mentality, and therefore I'm not going to do it. Because you kind of have to, there's a balance, right? And so like from your own experience, how did you deal with that when you were kind of in an entry kind of role where you felt that, wow, like I'm taking on a whole lot of things that may not necessarily fall within the bounds of my roles and responsibilities? How did you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's an interesting one for me because I've had people be that kind of like not in my job description kind of approach. And it drives me bonkers because I'm the absolute opposite. Like I believe, and I think in my first year of work in particular, what you do have in that first year is you have this license to ask really dumb questions and like ask a ton of questions and just like like your job, a big part of your job is to learn, right? And that's like one of the reasons why I end up not saying no as much as I should is because I love to learn. Like I am primarily driven by learning. And so I say yes to everything because I'm like, oh, this is a cool new thing that like I could learn so much about. And then suddenly I like not learning that much because I'm just doing too many things, right? Like that's when I am in my like unhealthy not saying no place, that's why it happened usually. And so I haven't had that experience of being like, well, that's not really my job description. I kind of wish I started to have like think that way a little bit more, a little bit sooner. And like now I have to think that way more and more because it's like certain things like, no, I need to delegate that. Like I cannot effectively fulfill my job description and be strategic if I end up, taking on the lunch order, for example, like random things like that. Like I just don't have time. So I think for that first year, I would really encourage people to say like your job description is to learn and understand the business as fully as you can. And so like to the degree that it's not completely wearing you out, it's probably better to say yes to things in a thoughtful manner, right? Like if it's not feasible for you to do it all at once, that's a different thing. But it's not to say, no, that's not in my job description. It's to say, wow, this is really interesting. I would love to learn more about this. Here are all the other things on my plate. Like, do you want to shift me into that role? Which I don't necessarily, like, full transparency. Like, I don't know that much about this. I don't have this skill that I think is critical to it. And so then like you learn as much as you're going to learn, but you might, they might take a step back. They might have assumed that you had that skill set that makes you not think you're fit for that role. Or they might be like, well, you're really smart. Like you could learn that skill set. Do you want to? Like you don't really know where it's going to take you. So I would say early in your career, it's like, it's probably worth having that maybe conversation while also just being aware of your limitations and somewhat open about them. But I would never put it as like, that's not in my job description. I would always, that sounds really cool, but here's the reasons I'm a little concerned about it. What do you think?
I love how you framed it. Cause just saying no, that gets the opposite. That could get you fired kind of mentality.
Yeah, because the assumption, like if I hear that from somebody that's like, no, I don't, like, that's not in my job description. Why don't you do it? Like I'm hearing like this person's not super motivated, doesn't really care about the business, just cares about like their role. And like, that doesn't, at a startup, you need to be flexible. And you need to be committed to, like, everyone should have an ownership mentality around like bigger picture business goals. Yeah. Now I had the opposite problem. Like I said, like, I think it's also really important to acknowledge and be specific about your limitations so that you're not over promising and under delivering. Cause there were definitely situations where like what I did was probably good enough, but at what cost, right? Like, yeah. It like took me a solid 3 years to get to a point where like I really understood my limitations.
Baltimore, I feel like you unmuted. Did you have a comment, a question? I don't think so.
Still unmuted. We can't hear you, but if you want to drop it in chat. I feel like recently Zoom has been doing all sorts of weird technical issues. I've been on a couple calls where like mics aren't working. What else? What are the other, I think we're talking a lot about how to strategically respond when you want to say no. Are there also situations where you've already said yes and then you realize that it probably should have been a no? I think that's when I've also had to, as you might have guessed from things I've said already, I've had to deal with times. It's also totally fine to be like, hey, like I bit off more than I can chew. We might need to roll this back. Again, like asking for help, I think at a startup, it's really necessary. And like no one's gonna like judge you for it. That may be intuitive to some people. I don't think it is for everybody. What else? Marvelous. When you started working, did you feel like is part of the issue not knowing what questions to ask?
I think that would be a fair assumption and probably did contribute to my inability to say no early on. You've actually asked a couple of good questions now that I'm like, oh man, I wish I had thought to like ask that like giving them kind of a layout of like, here's everything that I'm doing right now. Like, how do you want me how do you visualize this fitting in, or like, how does this meet our quarterly goals, or like, how does this, like, I never asked those questions. And I'm like, wow, like that's almost like a given now that you've said it. And now I feel like I sort of asked those questions. I could probably do a better job of doing that. But yeah, definitely early on, not knowing how to like assess the ask to then think about the yes or the no, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is relatively intuitive stuff. So once you kind of once it clicks, you're kind of like, why don't I always do this? And then it's like, it's actually really hard to put into practice. I think that, like, even once you kind of come to the conclusion that, like, I need to ask about the timeline, or I need to ask about what the goal is, or I need to think about what the risks are, or like, ask something like, hey, like, this sounds great. As I think about this project, like, where do you see potential pitfalls that I should look out for, or like risks? Where you see, like, which parts do you think are going to take how much time, like that kind of stuff. I think the hardest piece of this sometimes is in the moment where the situation just starts to move really fast. Mm-hmm. Just because it's startups, it typically, like, decisions can be made very quickly. So other questions that I think can kind of slow the conversation down a little bit. You can also just say, oh, that sounds so interesting. Tell me more about it. Like, you don't have to come up with with a super strategic question. It could even be like, what inspired this? Like, just like give yourself some time for them to talk so you can think about, like, which question do I want to prioritize. Mm-hmm. And also, like, learn a little bit about where the idea came from. I think that sometimes another way too to get that buy-in, or that initial, like, have them feel like you're on the same page and kind of the same, like, feeling of a yes, of like, wow, what a cool idea. Like, what made you think of it? That kind of puts you on the same page, and then also gives you space to then say, okay, so, like, in practice, what does this really look like? Let's slow this conversation down and say, like, what do you need from me? What are you going to be able to contribute to this too? Right? Like, I think sometimes that's a big piece of it too. Like, I have made this mistake as a leader or as a manager, where I'll be like so excited about a project, and my team members like, oh yeah, like, I want to take this on. But, like, it's going to need a lot of support from me. Mm-hmm. And I'm not always thinking about that. And so as a team member, if you can kind of think through, like, so as we go about this, like, these are the things, like, what are the things where you'll want to check in or approve it? And, like, really, that's just kind of being courteous to some degree, because they might not be thinking about what's going to be involved in it for them. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of little things like that people don't always talk about. Like the hidden work in work.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of like reveal that as you're making a decision. Because they also have families or friends, or, want to have weekend plans. Like, if you think something's going to be a really big project, you can also kind of help get your boss on the same page by helping them think about it from their perspective, to where it might be more their idea that, like, oh, maybe actually I don't want you to run with that, because then I'm going to have to run with it.
Yeah, you definitely drop some gems there too. Just like asking them how they're, how they're going to support you. I've never thought about that. How about, we have like 3 more minutes left. What about when, a coworker, is asking you to do something, and maybe if, we're entry level, we're kind of new to the workforce, and they're slightly older, like, this is a particular scenario, but like, how do you say, like, no?
Yeah, and that's a great example too, because
lateral no.
Like, well, lateral no's are hard too,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes, like, if you say a lateral yes, and then your direct report might not want you working on that, like, that can also get you into trouble. Yeah, I think it is okay, like laterally, and especially, it's really okay to just say, like, that's really like not something I'm sure I have time for, but let me talk to Dave or whoever your boss is about how I can get that, like, see if I can fit that in.
Mhm.
And just say, hey, yeah, like that sounds like something I potentially could do, or like that's something outside my skill set. Um, I would always talk to your manager though. Like there's no reason not to loop them in. Again, if you're at a place where that's gonna cause like super ruffled feathers and people are gonna have like, I don't know, some weird fallout around that, like you probably don't want to work there.
Right. Kind of
Um,
speak to the culture.
yeah, like
Mhm.
now if it's like a little thing, like, hey, can you order lunch today because I'm gonna be out of office and we're the two people like at this level, like obviously, like the little things, I would also always kind of do a cost benefit analysis. That probably goes without saying. Like if it's a little thing, it's probably not that big a deal. That said, like I also think as women, so often these like housekeeping tasks get delegated to us,
Mhm.
and that really limits your ability to progress, right? So like if laterally, or if you're a manager, like either thing, if you're getting the coffee run, the et cetera, um, at our place we order lunch, the taking out the trash or organizing the party for people's, and maybe you want to do that stuff. If you do, that's great. But it also, like, remember that that kind of company culture stuff does cut into your professional time. If you're not in HR, like you don't really need to be taking on HR responsibilities. I think that that's something that like I've definitely seen a lot of women kind of hold themselves back by taking on those like mom jobs, um, and not really realizing that they were kind of going to get stuck in them. So I try as much as possible. I never volunteer myself for that kind of work, anything kind of administrative, anything. Um, yeah, I call them mom jobs, which I shouldn't have, that's a terrible way to put it, but it kind of like, like you don't want to be the work mom and you don't want everyone relying on you for emotional support or having to be the one that like prints everything and like binds things. Like, yes, your first year, that's probably okay, because that's a part of being like entry level. But like that should end after your first year or so.
Mhm.
Unless you're like a two-person startup where everyone does everything, right? Like obviously grain of salt, but I think that would be the one thing I would say,
Mhm.
especially laterally, like you do not want to say yes to those kinds of
Right.
things too
Because once you
quickly.
start saying yes, it's people start expecting you to do it. And like when you stop doing it, it's like, oh, like you didn't do this thing. It's like, oh, well, like I just kind of did it because I wanted to. It wasn't really like my job per se.
Yeah, and it eats into your time. You never want it to become your job. Like
Mhm.
unless you want to be people ops. Like, and that's cool too, but you want to be like strategic people ops. You don't just want to be like doing administrative stuff only, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Thank-
Well, thank you so much, Maggie. Thanks for
Yeah.
coming on and just being awesome and sharing a little bit about your experience and talking about how to strategically say no at work. I know that I personally am going to be using some of the tips and the tricks that you shared in this session. So we're at the hour mark or the 45-minute mark now. We have 10 minutes of break time allocated to you all. So I want to be respectful of that. I'm going to drop the link to the raffle in the chat. We've got some really dope, if I know how to copy and paste, please. We've got some really dope prizes, which if you check the Slack channel, we've got Kuna swimwear, we've got like a massage coupon thing. We've got Bold Exchange. It's like a Black owned business. They do some really cool like coffee stuff. So yeah, so enter the raffle. You won't regret it. I mean, it's just a matter of putting on your name. It's free. People love free things. So yeah, thank you so much for being here and tuning in.
Thanks, guys.